Hi, welcome everyone to the final day of the 2022 Professional Bootcamp brought to you by the Gamers and the Long and sponsored by Ritual Motion, Streamlabs, Respawn, iFolio. My name is Raccine and I'm so excited to kick off day three with my co-panelists, Kay and Raffy. Somehow I didn't botch that intro, y'all, so give me gold stars in the chat for that one. Why don't you two lovely folks introduce yourselves and then I will get to going with this beautiful panel.
My name is Caelus. I go by she, they pronouns. I am non binary and I have experience in the collegiate esports scene, social media, and most recently, PR and marketing.
Hey everyone, my name is Raffy. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and I am the president and a founding board member of NYC Gamers. We're a nonprofit, recently acquired 501c3 status, and our mission is to uplift and amplify gamers across the intersections of race, gender, ability, sexuality, and age through education, information, and advocacy.
Those are beautiful intros, honestly. I promise you I would have stuttered through at least five of those sentences, so really smooth. And hi, my name is Raccine. That's pronounced as Racine, like a ray of sunshine. My pronouns are any, all, and it just so happens that I'm also non binary. Hi. I'm a communications, DEI, and HR/recruitment professional that specializes in empathy driven, engagement based community development and management. So we do all the advocacy around here through community building. And I'm so excited to speak with you both today about your identities, what this means to you, how this has impacted, your experience in the games industry, and really just what non-binary is to both of you. I think that would be a great way to start all of this. Like how do you experience being non-binary? What does this identity mean to you and how do what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I've identified as non binary since I was very little. And my friend's mom actually asked me if I saw myself as a girl or a boy. And I said, I don't know. I just see myself as me. I don't really prescribe to any notion of what those words meant. And I later found out that that meant I was very, very much non binary. And no matter what I look like or no matter how I'm presenting that gender identity, non binary always just comes down to I'm just me and I don't prescribe to any sort of notion of what my gender is supposed to be to anybody that's perceiving me.
I had a really complicated history with my relationship with gender growing up, right? So like I'm surrounded by trans folks in my life. They're my chosen family, ballroom community, so much community, right? And I always hear these stories of like, oh, I always knew, oh, when I was a kid, this and that and the third. And I'm like, I wish I had that. I was raised Catholic. So I'm like I'm like, coming from a family where I was the legitimate black sheep in the family, being born out of wedlock, like being the darkest skinned person in my immediate family, right? Like there was just so much that I was already navigating and surviving that when I think about my relationship to gender, the best way I could summarize it is I just didn't co-sign the expectations of masculinity that were expected of me, especially being the only quote unquote son, right? So it's interesting because in Latinx culture, there's a song called El Gran Varón by Willie Colon, and El Gran Varón is it's a it's kind of like spoken word, a poem in song, right? And it's about a kid who's born to a family that is very well off. And the father is looking at this baby boy and it's like, you are never going to be without. You're going to be my son. You're going to be the king of kings, the man, right? And when he gets older, the little boy goes off to college. He actually goes to NYU. And the father decides to go on a trip to New York to surprise his son, his boy. And before he sees him, he stops at a bar to get a drink. And while he's there, he's flirting with this woman that's at the bar. And the woman responds to him and is like, "You don't recognize me? It's me, Simon. It's me, it's your son, it's your boy." So he gags. He's homophobic, transphobic, and he
Oh
leaves the
no.
bar and he never comes back to see him. And trigger warning, content warning. Simon was living in New York City at the time where, being trans wasn't something that was as accessible. That's not that accessible today either. But it was also at the height of the AIDS epidemic, right? And unfortunately, we lost Simon, and that's what the whole song is about, right? So I say all of that because that song, Gran Barong, is a huge reflection of my life. And I feel like, my journey being non binary, I didn't get to come out until I was 27. And it had a lot to do with the expectations that came upon me being Black, being Puerto Rican, being Catholic, being my father's only son, like all these things, and having to accept that there's this entire other part of who I am that my family will just never be invited to or just doesn't want to accept. And I had to be okay with that. I had to acknowledge that I'm not always going to be the gran varón that they expect me to be.
Yeah, I really resonate with that, especially like, the sociocultural factors that play into you being able to express your gender identity and your fluidity and all of these things freely because I am a Jamaican living in Jamaica, right? And so a lot of these things are not accepted. And, as of recently in the media, they've been showing more about things like pronouns. And, it's really fulfilling to see that, but there's still that level of, okay, there is this underlying homophobia and denial of identity that's going on within the space. And I think how I came to realize that I really fit in with the non-binary identity was growing up. I never really, I wasn't really raised with any particular gender roles or anything concrete. Everything that I wore was androgynous, and mainly at that time, I was in a very strict household. There were a lot of other layers going into that, but of course, my father specifically would, buy all of the clothing, and it happened to be mostly androgynous. I never really heard anything about feminine stereotypes, which is usually common within a masculine dominated Jamaican household. And then I also grew up seeing my mother being the breadwinner. So, like, I saw those subverted gender roles. I saw that lack of identity within myself. I never really, if anything, I would say I was raised in a more masculine way, and so I never really found myself, attached to any particular notion of gender growing up. And so now I find myself saying I don't really care, which is why I use any all pronouns. To me, everything is fluid in a sense, and so whatever you see me as is whatever I present as in that moment. And so that's kind of my relationship with gender. It's very fluid, it's very loose, very open. And I would say even within the Jamaican context, if you say you're non-binary, they're like, oh, you're a confused woman or you're a confused man. Especially for men, it's a lot harder in society when they are trying to figure out identity. And when you have someone who is AMAB, for example, coming out as non-binary, that is an entirely different layer of, I would say, bias than someone who's AFAB coming out as non-binary in Jamaica. So I really resonated with what you were saying, Raffy, in terms of all of these layers and how they play into how late you come out as well and how comfortable you are coming out. And I kind of want to go from there to talk about what has your experience been within the games industry and other industries as well as a non-binary person, and how has this impacted your experience?
I would say that my identity as a non-binary person in the games industry has been on full blast every single day I've been in the games industry, because how my identity is perceived by everybody around me has constantly impacted how I feel I can approach my passions in this industry and my career in the industry. When I started off in collegiate esports, I had a massive issue where everyone saw me as a cis woman. And I had never really identified with femininity. I mean, when you think about stereotypical gender expression, I had very short hair. I dressed very androgynous. I binded every day. And I don't think I gave off any feminine vibes. It was just how the games industry saw me. I was either a cis male or a cis woman. And because of that, not only was I not treated as non binary, as who I am, I was being treated as a woman and dealing with immense, constant sexism from my teammates, from coaching situations, just constant belittling on both fronts. And I felt like I was fighting a war for equity for a gender I didn't even associate with, on top of trying to fight my own challenges to have any sort of equity over my identity and how I was treated as a result of it. And that's carried on a little bit into the professional end of things too. Once I graduated, a lot of situations where I get put in rooms where my opinion is not taken into, I think, the exact same consideration as others because I'm either perceived as a cisgender woman or I'm being perceived as non binary. And I'm still facing the sexism that comes alongside that to this day in a lot of conversations.
Yeah, I definitely feel that as well, coming in, with that level of also intersectionality in terms of race playing into gender identity and then what people perceive you as. Definitely coming in early in the games industry, I faced heavy, sexism and racism. And because I came in so young as well, I wasn't, I would say my level of awareness of like racially discriminatory behavior was a little bit low because I'm also coming from that Jamaican background and we're a majority black country, but we have high levels of colorism. So I'm able to identify that more easily than this very covert racism that's going on within the space. So when I came in so young and so early, dealing with a lot of discrimination from mainly cis, and plus, coming to terms with my identity, that was a lot to deal with. So I definitely feel, you know, that level of, okay, having to fight this battle of sexism on different fronts, and then plus the racism, and growing into realizing that, oh my gosh, wow, this is a lot. This is a whole package that I didn't bargain for, y'all. Like, so Rafi, tell me a little bit about your experience in the industry, because I know your perspective is going to be a little bit more nuanced in that sense.
It's interesting because I find myself kind of leaning into what you both have shared, and it feels so affirming, right? Because it's like being non-binary, it's who I am, right? Like we could talk about this all day long about how gender identity is not a choice, right? But it is a revelation. It is something where, like, whenever I talk to youth about this, I say we're on our gender journeys, right? And not everyone's gender journey has a destination. Sometimes our journey has milestones, right? But not everyone's gender journey has a roadmap or a destination, and that's okay, right? And I can out myself as a non-binary person because I will always be perceived as being a cis gay man in a gaming space, especially being the president of NYC Gamers, right? So they're like, "Oh, okay, this is just some, Latino gay man who runs this like boys club." And that's like a lot of the like surface level BS that I have to deal with, right? So I feel like you know, add to that I'm black, Puerto Rican, disabled, like all these other multitudes that make me who I am, I'm going to be loud, and I'm going to be the person to feel like I'm constantly fighting to be seen, but like to be truly seen in a space and be like, I'm non-binary. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, you know? And there's this energy that comes with that because I do have to deal with a lot of the other shit, right? So it's like I have to deal with being assumed or being perceived as male or like as a man in a space where there will be a lot of queer women, a lot of white women, and a lot of folks who love to. And look, I keep it very transparent. The feigning or the performance of fragility is whooping ass out here. And there will always be folks who have the best of intentions in queer spaces who are not checking their privileges the way that they show up in different ways, you know? So they see someone like me in the LGBTQIA plus spaces, in queer gaming spaces, right? And they may not kind of like it may not click that they're still perceiving me as someone who embodies male privilege in a space, even though I've made it very clear that I'm non-binary. I have the pin, I have the badge, I have the shirt, I have all the things. So I have to, and then on top of that, doesn't matter how I identify, I still have to navigate a world where people are still reacting in trauma, right? It's like they're still responding to their trauma. So someone can see me and know that I'm non-binary, but the way that I show up or navigate the world, folks can respond to their internalized trauma in a way where they assume me. to be someone who can cause them harm in a misogynistic way. And I have to check that. I know that it's not about me, and I love enough to be able to hold space. It also means I need to go to therapist to a therapist to work on me, because I'm like, yo, I'm showing up for women, I'm showing up for non-binary folks, I'm showing up for my community, and it's a double-edged sword. So yeah, you know.
Yeah, that was definitely a lot to navigate, and I know your day to day is definitely a lot of this balancing act of, okay, how do I, continue to freely and safely and comfortably express myself while being fully aware of all of the things that play into existing within a space, like privilege, as you mentioned, and even disability and neurodiversity. So let's kind of shift into that because I think that factors in a lot to this. So, I feel like neurodiversity plays a lot into our community, into our space, and I think it's something that we should really shed light on. I am a neurodiverse person, and I have mental health issues as well. I think that plays into a lot of how we express ourselves within the space. So, kind of tell me a little bit about your experiences as neurodivergent people, and how this has maybe impacted your identity and the way you express yourself.
I may need Raffy to speak on that first.
Yeah, no, no doubt, no
We
doubt.
all love Raffy, so we all love Raffy's
I love
talks,
y'all.
okay?
Y'all are amazing. Y'all just out here inspiring me and affirming. I love it. I'm thinking about how, again, this is one of those things where I feel like I'm not enough or I don't belong, right? Because there's a lot of gatekeeping that happens in mental health on the mainstream, and neurodivergence has such a stigma to it on both sides. So, when I was navigating the fact that I might be living with ADHD and that I might be neurodivergent, it became something where I didn't have access to the medical care that I needed to get a diagnosis. But then I had so many loved ones who do have diagnoses or are living on the spectrum or are neurodivergent, because those two things don't always align. And they're the folks who are telling me like, no, self-diagnosis is valid. And I'm like, okay, how do I navigate that in a way where I'm holding myself accountable, and I'm checking myself every step of the way, and I'm not taking up space? And but like, even with that language, right? It's like, there I go again. It's just like me being non-binary. It's just like me being black but not perceived as African American, because I'm black Latinx. Like, there's always these things when it comes to the nuances of identity where we feel, or I'll speak from the I feel like I'm just not meeting the complete picture of what it is to be this identity. I'm not enough, right? I'm not going as far as I need to fit the prerequisites. So I guess that's my relationship with mental health, because, I say it. I'm not afraid to name that I'm living with ADHD, that I'm neurodivergent, that I live with invisible disabilities related to back pain and all the things, right? But I also am the kind of person where somebody were to invite me on a panel that's specifically on living with disabilities or being neurodivergent, I would probably refer them to someone else. And that says a lot about me, because why is it that I feel like I don't belong at that table? What's up with the table? Let's talk about it.
Yeah, I actually, you bring up a really great point of imposter syndrome that I wasn't even thinking of at first, but yes, absolutely. Um, Growing up, I grew up on Tumblr, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you think about it. And there was this huge push at the time about what non-binary looked like. I think we were at a point in time historically where non-binary still had a gender expression that was correct, and non-binary had a gender expression that was incorrect at the time. So there was a lot of imposter syndrome growing up that heavily played into some of the mental health issues that I have. Like, I have depression, I have anxiety, I think I have ADHD. I definitely experience imposter syndrome all the time. And there was just this constant battle in my head of how to do everything right on top of how to express myself in a way where I felt like the onus was on me to be respected rather than on everybody else to just respect me inherently. And I faced a lot of problems because people would tell me, you don't look trans, you don't look non-binary, oh, you don't want to transition, ooh, that's a little suspicious. And I was like, no, I'm just me exploring my gender. I just don't understand why that's wrong to you exploring your own gender. And it was just a constant battle, even up until I just picked up she, her pronouns for the first time in like 8+ years. And that is a whole battle in and of itself of, just because I go by she, her now alongside my they, thems doesn't mean I'm any more of a woman than I was before. I'm still not a woman. It's just I'm just becoming a little bit more comfortable expressing myself outside of the binary, which is what you would think non-binary should mean.
Yeah, that is
But
so key too, because it is a collection of things, and it could be something on its own, right? Like being non-binary doesn't mean you can't be non-binary and a woman, or non-binary and a man, or just non-binary, or something else completely outside of the binary. That's the point. The way you express yourself within that, I mean, the whole point is that there's no constraint. And so the level of projection, I think, that goes on within the space factors into that level of imposter syndrome that we might experience alongside the other factors that play into that. So it's super important that you both mentioned that, because, like I said, I really do see a lot of projection in the space. Like, oh, this is what a non-binary person should look like. And I did see that in the Tumblr era too. Non-binary people should look perfectly androgynous. We shouldn't be able to tell, there shouldn't be any element of femininity or masculinity or anything else. And then you realize, like, if it's non-binary outside of the binary, why does it matter,
Can
right?
I add to that?
Yeah.
So, okay. So I think it's important to talk about intersectionality, right? It's a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, right? So it's like it's impossible for me to talk about one part of who I am without acknowledging how all of me makes me who I am, right? Like I can't compartmentalize my identities because I can't leave part of me at home. I'm always showing up in my multitudes, right? So I find it interesting when we're having these conversations. And thank you so much for bringing up imposter syndrome, because that is the key word, right? I also think about like the language that we're using, right? The descriptors, terms like non-binary, neurodivergent, like all these words, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that these parts of who we are, these identities, have always existed long before the English language, long before colonialism, long before white supremacy, or at least the way that it shows up today compared to the way that it did before, right? So when I think about, you know, non binary and how it is perceived, I have to remind myself when I'm navigating that non binary was constructed within the tools of white supremacy. Non binary, I mean, the binary itself is a construct of white supremacy. The expectations of what it is to be AMAB or AFAB is deeply inherently aligned with the power and privilege necessary to upkeep male supremacy, white male supremacy. There's an elitism that comes with that. There's a quote unquote cleanliness that comes with that, right? So even when you're trying to divert from the path, there's still this, yeah, I'm different, but I'm not black. I'm different, but I'm not this, but I'm not that. I'm not a woman. I'm not the worst types of oppressed because I still fit in this ratio, right? And I think that that's where it whoops our asses, and that's where it becomes this internal struggle of like imposter syndrome. Because I know for me, speaking from the I have a really hard time accepting myself as non-binary, especially when I go on websites like Twitter, where the non-binary platform, the hashtag, is heavily saturated by white people, and it's
Oh my
heavily
gosh,
saturated
yes.
by people who self-identify as non-binary queer women, right? And I think that that's absolutely valid, and I'm not here to get into the minutia of that, but what I do say is you will never be able to represent me as another non-binary person because your non-binariness doesn't intersect with my blackness the way that it needs to be. So, you can be of an oppressed people, but you're still holding on to, you still have these advantages systemically they're going to make it that your navigating non-binary is going to look different than mine. You
Yeah.
know, and I could say the same thing being AMAB, and I hate having to say that. I think that it's so redundant that we have to talk about whether we're AMAB or AFAB once we accept ourselves as non-binary. I think that that within itself is problematic. And speaking from the I will still name that as someone who is assumed male, I have to check myself and how I show up. Sucks, double-edged, but it is what it is. We're navigating systemic, power and privilege.
Yeah, that's definitely
Facts.
a lot to unpack, and just talking about that cleanliness. That is something that, above all else, that specific phrase that you use, it resonates a lot because that is how it feels. That is the experience that you have as a Black person who also identifies as non-binary. You feel like there's that level of erasure that comes in the community and comes in your self-expression. So when you present yourself as such, in the space, you feel like, who do I look at here? Because if you go on Twitter and look at the non-binary hashtag, you're going to see a majority white community, and that's I think that speaks to a lot of things in life, and that's a great segue into representation, I think. So tell me a little bit about not only representation in games, but also in the media that you consume, whether that's social media or TV or whatever it could be. Tell me how your relationship with representation has been and how you feel about it now, and maybe how you felt about it growing up.
I'm having a hard time thinking about like, right? Are you too, right? Like it's like
Yeah.
I'm like, it's interesting when I think about non-binary in the media, the only person like my default person is there's a show that was on FX called Pose. And if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. But there's this one person, Angel Baby, Angel. Um, so the actress that plays them in real life, I can't believe I'm having a brain fart. This coffee needs to kick in, but they are non-binary in reality, and they use they them pronouns. And they are the only non-binary person that I've seen on television that is remotely close to how I perceive myself being represented in the media. And as for gaming, hi. Um, I'm like us, I guess, like right. I'm
We are
like
the blueprint.
we are the blueprint. I mean, there's no shade, but we're showing up. We're here, right?
Right. Wow. I thinking about
I'm sorry, I gave you
representation
a
in the
hard
media.
question.
I mean, on that topic of like intersectionality, I have a lot of privilege as a white person who is identified by other people as a cis white woman. That is a whole layer of just, privilege to like try and hide under. But I guess I don't want to. And I guess like I have always been super dissatisfied by the lack of any diversity in the media. Growing up, I hated watching TV. I hated watching movies because, especially those forced cis het white romances that everybody used to clown on growing up, it's still prevalent to this day. And it's getting better. And I think that's because companies are thankfully picking up on the negative feedback and the criticisms from those in marginalized identities and saying, well, we have to switch or we're not going to stay relevant. Am I happy that that's the way we're starting to get more diversity? No, but it has to happen that way. And I guess as time is moving on, it's been getting better seeing more trans actors having more roles, more actors of color getting to be on, massive productions, having their own productions where they're not a sidelined character, and kind of just continuing to push for that and not condoning the archaic old ways in even very recent years of just
Yeah.
white cis het actors, performers, artists, animated characters. Just there's a lot of change I think that needs to happen there, and there's just so much to unpack that I don't even know how I could ever be satisfied with the lack of diversity in media, and especially in gaming. We are showing up and we are showing out, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done there too in terms of respecting what it means to be non-binary as a community, but also when it comes to how we respond to individuals and their needs as a non-binary person in the industry.
Yeah, and I think for such a developing industry to remember the games industry as a whole is very young, immature in a sense, and still sort of trying to align itself in a way that will allow it to flourish. So there are a lot of these problems that will factor into that, and I think acceptance and awareness and understanding and empathy are things that are still being nurtured into the space. So that is definitely a lot. I see that Verda has a really good question. Somehow my brain, when I saw any all, I was like, Verda, are you calling me any
Hey,
all? We'll
Verda.
have to fight. We have to fight because you know my name is not any all. And then I realized. So the question was, how? Okay, so y'all brought up the question on the screen. How do we work to deconstruct the thinking that continues to oppress? How can we be co-liberators alongside our non-binary siblings in the gaming space? I love Verda. Verda always has great questions. Honestly.
Yes. Hmm. All right. Well, first and foremost, I think that the way that the game her shows up in response to non-binary representation in gaming is a great way to start. I think that it goes above and beyond the bare minimum. There are a lot of spaces that will welcome non-binary people into their gaming spaces, and they'll say, oh, we're a safe space, right? And then you have groups like NYC Gamers, the Gamers, right, where there's more intention around how are we making sure that we have staff and volunteers that are a reflection of our intentions? How are we making sure that we are supporting and uplifting the folks who are sharing their emotional labor or their education or their lived experience in ways that's going to amplify the importance of representation in gaming culture? Right. I think that taking it to that level, making sure that it's a part of your strategic plan is a step in the right direction. And I think that the only other thing I will add to that is, if your concept of diversity, inclusion, or equity is, what's the word I'm looking for, y'all? Compartmentalized, right? Like you need to do LGBTQ 101, anti-blackness 101, disability justice 101. If you need to give each thing its own time, but you're not having conversations that show up in ways that are intersectional, then you're not doing a good enough job. We need to do better because I promise you that your conversations about LGBTQIA plus communities are going to be saturated and centered in whiteness. Your conversations about non-binary are going to be heavily uplifted by whiteness, disability justice, whiteness. Like there's so much to unpack in that. And it's hard. It's difficult, especially because there's not a lot of primary sources to pick from, right? But that's why these spaces are so important because there's nothing more relevant than a primary source that is the lived experience of folks who are holding on to multitudes of identities and how they show up in these spaces vulnerably, but also resiliently.
Absolutely agree. um, I think if you can't have those conversations when it comes to how our identities intersect, you're just missing the point altogether. And I absolutely think that the first step is giving non binary people the space that they already have objectively, but giving that to them within the confines of, you know, gaming or esports or really any industry. Having those conversations behind the scenes, hearing that lived experience, understanding feedback, criticism, and then really I think the next big step would be implementation and how you implement that and how you spread that message and those stories from the people on your team, on your end of the things into the world so that other non-binary people, know that they're welcome with you and understand that there's that safe space there. Because I think a big thing for me is before I really began to identify with womanhood a little bit more than I have in the past, I didn't feel very welcome in most spaces if they weren't for trans people essentially. And I think now there is like an added layer of privilege where in spaces originally created with womanhood in mind, I find solace in that as, somebody that's now coming back to terms with that. But it's also the language, it's also the inclusivity, it's also seeing people like me on screen, seeing people like me on messaging, on the graphics, in the streams, on the games, that kind of stuff really goes the distance. And I think it all really starts with hearing what non-binary and trans people have to say and then putting that experience into what you create as a result.
Yeah. Those were really beautiful answers, honestly. And I think going back to the point of the industry, in a space that is so saturated by communities, um, with that hint of like industry immaturity, developing these spaces with that level of, all of the things, right? And even if it's a space specifically for a segment of people, understanding the intersectionality that arises from within these spaces. So, the Game Hers was mainly a woman and femme centric community, but within that, you have Black women, you have Asian women, you have so many different, you have disabled femmes. Like there's so much to unpack there, that within communities you have these subspaces. And I talk about this a lot as a community builder, in terms of how do we build these well-rounded, wholly accepting spaces by acknowledging these subgroups within a main space, right? So having this space to open up room to have these discussions for all of these groups, if possible, right? Or at least giving space for these conversations, whether that's through a dedicated Discord channel or whatever it could be. It's so key to creating a well-rounded, truly open and comfortable community space. Honestly, it's that is the key. So I kind of wanted to open up room to, have you communicate about, like, what are some community spaces where you really felt comfortable? You didn't feel like you had to code switch, for example, or, do anything that made you feel out of alignment with yourself.
Oddly,
Shameless plug, the Game Hers app. Shameless, like I love the whole process of me setting up my account and everything and showing up. I felt like I didn't have to leave part of me behind, and that means a lot because I promise you, I don't get that on Grinder, and I don't get that on LinkedIn, right? Like, you know,
You
um,
said grinder. Oh no.
hello. I mean, look, it's no shade,
Oh
but you gotta
no.
meet the people where they're at. You know, like you're talking about
Now
gaming
listen,
culture. um,
listen, me and grinder. Ooh, no.
Right. I mean, look, even OK Cupid, it's like they try to
Okay,
make it
Cupid
that
is
you
better.
can, right? I'm like they try to make it so that it's you can bring all of you to the table. And OK Cupid is a they try, right? But it's not always that simple. And
Yeah.
I feel like there are community spaces that are very intentional about saying you belong, about saying, every part of who you are is seen and is welcome, right? So I love that because I feel like I have that when I navigate the Game Hers app. And again, shameless plug, my NYC Gamers Discord community, right? Like we intentionally made that as a space where, yeah, it better be something that the president of the organization feels safe and feels comfortable navigating and all the things. So I think that it's about it sucks, but sometimes we as non-binary people have to create safe spaces, right? But when we find those rare places that do have us in mind and are intentional, those are the places that we kind of like set our roots in.
I would have to say the same thing. I think when I first made my profile on the Gamers app, I felt the same way. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like it was going to get pushed to the side. My identity was frontward facing and people acknowledged it and everyone respected it. And it was the first time where I really felt safe enough to, on full blast, say, I am non binary, I am queer, and that's just me. Um, I've also felt that way about Wiggy. It's kind of how they've, treated me with respect. There was no awkward conversations around gender identity, around the pronouns talk. It was just completely natural. It was great. Everybody was respectful and kind. That same feeling is with the Gamers. And then oddly enough, the Dead by Daylight community, really, we run the Dead by Daylight. We run all of that. It's a heavily gay LGBTQIA plus, like everyone is so nice, everybody is so respectful. It's probably the most fun I've had as a streamer, interacting with other community members in that way. And it's very, I don't know, it's very comforting. It's like my comfort gay spot on the internet is Dead by Daylight.
I
Did
love
you hear
that.
that they announced that David King is
Yes.
gay?
Yes. And I think how they did that was also super respectful. I think those game devs are putting in a lot of like active thought into how they approach their media and recreate it to represent those who are consuming it. And I think they did an amazing job, and that was awesome. So much love for DBD.
Yeah, I love how we're highlighting these community spaces. And I definitely know of a lot of games that attract a majority queer community that feels so comfy and warm, like Apex, kind of, except for when you go on Apex voice chat and someone calls you a racial slur and you're like, okay, come on now, don't do that. But when you think about games as a whole, there's so many games now that some are performative. I will say some are performative. We have to acknowledge that. But some are genuinely including this diverse range of characters, not only queer, but a diverse range of pot characters, characters from different lived experiences and backgrounds, abilities, weights, everything. So there's this level of, hey, I can find myself in this game at some point, or at least relate to some extent, right? So a character might not be so open about all of the things, but when you look into their backstories or you read the comics accompanying these different games, you can get insight into them, like Mirage, for example, from Apex as a character example. There's so many characters that we can kind of reference as that kind of comfort space, or that character that we resonate with, right? So yeah, I really appreciate you uplifting. And yeah, we are not sponsored by the Game Hers. I'm just saying, like, y'all just went off about the Game Hers app. We're not sponsored. I mean, are we though? Technically, this is a Game Hers panel, y'all. So kind of.
No, but
But no.
I think that we keep it real, and like we name it. And yet, like, Verda knows me. I'll be real quick to be like, y'all need to fix that. But I think that it's legit. Like, of many of the spaces that I've navigated, they're doing an amazing job. And I think that they can take that model of what they're doing with the app, and they could package it and show other folks how to do better and how to go above the bare minimum. Because I think that asking someone their pronouns, we've moved past that.
I would have to agree. I think at this point, it's beyond just like the superficial stuff, the stuff that everybody has to know about everybody. And it's more about showing that implementation of like legitimate representation, not just that surface level. Well, we use your pronouns. We're
Yeah.
great allies. There's so much more to it. And it's not that complicated. It's honestly just a game of listening, respecting, and reflecting.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I had the pleasure of, being with the Game Hers as a DEI manager when they were developing the app. So I got to see the back end. We got to butt heads. We got to, share ideas and brainstorm. So I really got to see the care that was put into the app, even after launch, and, all of the things that came with launch, even some of the negative things. I understood that these were a given. Like, but I also got to see all of the work and the time and the care of the founders and all of the team members. They took so much time to do the research. Even myself, when I was a part of the team, I went on OkCupid. Girl, I don't like dating apps. I went on OkCupid to do UX research. I worked on the language with them. So it was an intentional process of everyone collaborating to really put the time and effort to make sure this would be a unique and pleasant and comfortable app experience. Hours and hours and hours, endless time spent on this. So it's so wonderful to hear that, the end product was this space where everyone could feel some sense of bliss, right? There's still the pitfalls, and there's still a level of, understanding that not every non-binary person will feel comfortable within that space because of the name and, other factors. But if you are a non-binary person that is comfortable being in that space and being present in that space, know that you will be heard. Your voice will be given space. You will have that room to feel comfortable to express yourself. So definitely big ups to the Game Hers app. If you haven't interacted with it already, touch all the buttons, go download it. Not sponsored, maybe hashtag ad, maybe hashtag sponsored. Took that from Kay. But yeah, this was fantastic, honestly. And I just want to give you room to share any closing remarks, anything that you really want to say before we, close off. I'm waiting for them to give me this closing copy because I'm social anxiety. Any closing remarks? Any like self promo?
Closing remark, definitely a self-love one. This space is so difficult to navigate, and if you are non-binary and trans, so much love and respect because every day you wake up and you are doing the damn thing and you are making a change just by being who you are. And I think that's something really beautiful. And I think that's something that we as a community should rejoice in, that like our mere existence is changing like the world and hopefully for the better. And to just remember to stay strong because this industry is pretty rough as it is right now. But there's people like us, and I'm sure people in the chat and people beyond who are making that difference every day.
I'm gonna say this. If you are non-binary and you're listening to this or watching this, know that you owe nobody androgyny. You owe no one a gender performance. Non-binary is very personal, and your expression doesn't always have to align with your identity. As a non-binary person, I sometimes wake up feeling gender euphoric, and there's sometimes where I wake up and I'm gender exhausted. So it's very fluid, it's very nuanced. Just live your truth. Go on a journey that centers your happiness uninterrupted.
That was really beautiful. I just want to thank, you know, let me scroll up because y'all, I lost a copy. I just, thank you everyone for joining us for this panel.